Hey, Dave Spalding, Handgun Combatives, and what I want to do in this particular video is another installment in our series of stupid shit I heard this week. And I really didn't hear it this week. I heard it several weeks ago when I was at the SHOT Show, just now getting around to doing a video on it. I was walking through the aisles and checking into different booths, and I was in the booth of a very well-known tactical firearms manufacturer. And as I was looking at the various, firearms and other accessories, I overheard a group of guys who were standing over here, and they were talking about a number of combative firearms related topics. Out of the clear blue, a rather young fella blurted out, "Anybody that shoots the reset is an asshole." Not sure where that came from. And the only thing I can figure is it's got to be out of ignorance of where the whole thing came from. Quite frankly, I've seen it quite a bit on social media, Facebook, the internet, people bashing the shoot to reset, pull and pin, catch the link, whatever the term is. And that's okay, that's fine, as they have the right to do that, but I can't help but wonder if they really understand where it came from. First of all, it was never intended to be a trigger control technique. It was intended to be a methodology to teach the shooter to be minimal on the trigger. And what am I talking about when I mean minimal? I'm talking about minimizing the movement of your index finger. Now, anybody that understands simple physiology understands that four fingers oppose a thumb. It makes us very unique in the animal kingdom. And these four fingers work sympathetically towards that thumb. I mean, just think about how many times since you've gotten up this morning and started watching this video that you've done this in some form or fashion. Grabbing hold of the door handle, shaking somebody's hand, grabbing the steering wheel, picking up the coffee mug or a drink glass. In and out, in and out, in and out. What, thousands of times a day? And how many times during a day do you isolate this finger and move it back and forth without moving the rest of them? Now you can see what a tall order that is, trying to isolate that trigger finger. Now keep in mind that what the hand does translates directly to the handgun and moves the muzzle around. 1/8 of an inch of muzzle movement at 20 feet is 4 inches. So instead of hitting somebody square in the center of the chest, now you're out here in a more periphery hit. So the ability to depress the trigger, and that's what we're talking about, applying a constant pressure to a breaking point. The ability to depress the trigger straight to the rear without moving the muzzle is critical. Whether it's competition or combat, you need to be able to do that. And when this finger moves back and forth, the rest of the hand wants to move sympathetically. If you look at a handgun, it's a big lever. There's no other way to describe it. And what you do down here at this end greatly affects what happens at the muzzle end. So when you convulsively grip the entire hand, it's going to move the muzzle around. Well, let's drop back to when we started transitioning from revolvers to semi-automatic pistols in the law enforcement community, because that's the first time I heard of the shoot to reset or pull and pin or whatever the case may be. Keep in mind, we were moving from double action revolvers. The double action revolver, every press of the trigger and release of the trigger activated some mechanism inside the gun. There was no waste in the trigger. As the trigger started back, it not only cocked the hammer, it turned the cylinder, and when you released it, it reset the cylinder, locked everything into place. There was a reason for it all back and forth, back and forth. Now, to truly work the revolver trigger, you had to get your hand a little further in so that you basically got your finger inside the first crease, so you had the leverage to do that. Anybody that cared about shooting their revolver well had an action job done on it, because there are so many parts that interact and interchange and line up with each other that a untampered with or A revolver without an action job was just a glitchy, catchy, kind of a snag fest, so to speak. Whereas if you had a good action job done, all of these parts just lined up with each other, rolled past, and you could literally get a good trigger action, moving the trigger back and forth without too much interrupting the muzzle. But you can see even there's some muzzle movement. Mostly because this gun is too big for me. This was my first service revolver in 1976. It's a Model 28 Smith & Wesson Highway Patrolman. I really didn't know about sizing the gun to me, so I bought what other people had. You know, I got through it, but you know, it wasn't optimal. Well, keep in mind when we went from this action right here over to a gun like this Smith & Wesson 3rd generation 9mm. This one happens to be a 3913. Take a look at the difference in the trigger action. The first one is long, just like the revolver. But then the subsequent ones were extremely short. See that? Very minimal movement. I'll show you again. Big disparity. Probably 3/4 to an inch depending on the type of gun. A big disparity in the long one to the short one. Well, what ended up happening were people would fire these guns and they would come all the way off the trigger and literally spank the trigger. Well, when you do that type of action with the trigger finger like this, it translates through the entire hand and ends up with something that looks like this. Well, that's a lot of muzzle movement. So where did shooting to reset come from? Well, actually the first time I ever saw it, it came from the FBI. This is my copy of the Pistol Transition Shooting Training Program from the FBI. And the date is kind of obscured on it. It's either May of 1990 or May of 1991. Now, the FBI was a pretty good resource for American law enforcement transitioning to pistols because American police agencies were revolver-oriented. Yep, the military had pistols, but they were 1911s, and they themselves were transitioning over to the M9 or the Beretta 92. The FBI was a good resource because at the time there were really two sources of information. There was Gunsight, with the modern technique of the pistol, very Weaver 1911 oriented, over to John Shaw's Mid-South Institute for Self-Defense Shooting, which was the original school that kind of took the IPSC, isosceles, speed shooting type stuff and translated that over to combat. And it was one of the best shooting schools I ever attended. I went there 3 times. Outstanding. It's still a very in-demand school with military special operations units and police SWAT teams and things like that. But the FBI had kind of taken the two disciplines and put them together, and along with the influence of Ken Hackathorn, came up with probably the leading pistol transition program. Now, inside this book is the first reference I ever saw to shooting to reset, and I'm going to just read it to you. It's called The Section on Trigger Control Explaining Transition Shooting. The first round is double action by holding the trigger to the rear, then riding the trigger forward until the sear engages, hence pressing the trigger to the rear. Each subsequent shot is fired single action. Note, slow DA pull harder to control than quick but smooth DA pull. Center pad of the trigger, not the first knuckle, but the center pad. So now we've even changed the positioning of the trigger finger as we've moved over. Center pad of trigger finger on trigger for all shots. Shooter must concentrate on holding the trigger back through the recoil. Exertion of recoil will drive the finger off the trigger if not careful. So there was a deliberate move to fire the shot, slide would work, gun would go back on target, you would let it out to reset, press the trigger. It was an initial learning method for trigger control. Think about how you first learned to drive a standard shift automobile. Complex skill, right? What most people did is they would push down on the accelerator, kind of revving up the engine, and as they did that, then they would let the clutch out very slowly, And when the car started moving forward, then they would push the clutch back in, go to the next gear. But it was a very deliberate this way, this out. But as time went by, that action got very, very smooth and you learned it. It was kind of like that was the training wheels for riding the bicycle. Well, shooting to reset, pull and pin, catching the link, that's all that was intended to be, was to teach people to be minimal on the trigger until they kind of got the idea that they didn't have to let their finger out every time. So what were we looking for? What you were looking for eventually was to fire the shot, and as the cane came back down, as the gun came back down, when the sight centered on the target, you were already ready to fire. But you had to learn how to do that minimal motion because you were going from here to here, here to here. Unlike the striker-fired pistols of today, like this Glock, that have very short triggers all the time. These things, you don't really need the whole pull and pin or shoot to reset like you did with the long double action, short single action triggers. They're very, very easy to stay minimal on the trigger. And then of course there's the 1911s, where because they have a truly sliding to the rear trigger, you can get away with all kinds of trigger manipulations on these. You can literally tap the triggers and get away with it without moving the muzzle. The question arises, should we still use the pull and pin, shoot to reset, catch the link? Well, I would. If I had a student show up in one of my classes that got out there and was just slamming on the trigger, I would take them back through it and I would say, this is what you do. Now go ahead and fire that shot, let the gun recoil. Now, when you see the sights, let it out, press it again, do it again. What am I teaching them to do? I'm teaching them to be minimal on the trigger. Now I know there's going to be some very noteworthy people out there that are going to disagree with me on this. But keep in mind, I'm not teaching high-end shooters. Well, these days I kind of do, but back in the days when I was doing police transition training, I was teaching basic shooters, people that shot a couple of times a year. And that method was very, very helpful in getting these people to go from the revolver trigger to the shorter reset trigger of the semi-automatic pistol. So if I had to come up and I was doing a basic class again, will I use that shoot to reset? Yeah, I probably would. Because it's a good way to teach people to be minimal on the trigger instead of all the way out engaging the entire hand. Now, in closing, the last thing I will address is the fact that people will say, well, you really don't need to do that if you hold on tightly. And this kind of thing will be demonstrated with a student holding on very tight and an instructor either engaging their trigger or putting a metal rod in there and slapping it, and the gun will go off and the shot will go right where the gun is being held. I agree with that. That does work. What that demonstration does not take into account is the sympathetic interaction of the whole hand. Because now I'm holding onto it like this, someone else is engaging the trigger, and I'm not fighting this finger wanting to engage the rest of the fingers. And I think that you have to do that because these fingers want to work sympathetically together, and you do that thousands of times a day. Then you go to the range and you do this, 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 this. Let's face it, the less distance you move this finger, the less likely the rest of the hand is going to engage. So when you're going from something like this to this, being able to stay in contact with the trigger is important. And let's face it, whenever you're controlling any type of mechanical mechanism, how do you control something if you don't stay in contact with it? So probably the answer is to try to teach people to be minimal on the trigger, stay in contact with it, and as they progress in a shooter, they learn that when the gun lines back up on target, the trigger's already set, ready to press. So, number of methodologies for that. But before we go around saying things like, anybody that shoots to reset is an asshole, you probably ought to need to understand the history behind it, where it came from, and its proper use as a method to teach minimal trigger action, not as a trigger control technique in its entirety. So I hope you learned something there. Dave Spalding, Handgun Combatives, thanks for checking in.